The city had never looked so large to Chiamaka, a simple villager with cracked heels and a head full of dreams. She wore her mother's old wrapper and carried a hand-woven basket, not to beg, but to sell. Inside the glistening glass walls of the mall, the smell of perfume, air conditioning, and imported leather struck her like thunder. People moved fast. Their eyes skipped over her as though she were invisible. But Chiamaka didn't care. She laid out 5 small baskets on the edge of a hallway near the exit, each made of raffia, beautifully knotted, and smelling of the wild palm forest from her village. She smiled at every passerby, hoping someone would see the value in what her hands had shaped. But it wasn't long before 2 security guards noticed her, narrowed their eyes, and began to approach. Chiamaka didn't flinch. She simply straightened her back and stood behind her baskets. In her mind, she wasn't out of place. She was just like every other business person in that building. But to them, she was a disruption. She didn't yet know her presence was about to cause a storm in a place that only respected power and polished shoes. They didn't ask her to leave gently. They didn't whisper or pull her aside. The security guard shouted, hands waving in the air like they were chasing off a stray dog. Shoppers turned, faces twisted in disgust, not at the guards, but at her. A child pointed. A woman pinched her nose. One of the guards picked up her baskets and tossed them into a dustbin, their contents spilling like torn pieces of dignity across the polished floor. Chemeka stood still, too stunned to cry. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. Her basket-making tools, her knife, her raffia thread, her calabash beads, all gone in seconds. Go back to your village, someone muttered behind her. The words struck her harder than the push that followed. She stumbled. Her wrapper loosened slightly at the waist. Still, she bent down, not to defend herself, but to gather what little pride she could from the floor. She picked up the scattered raffia, now stained with shoe polish and dust. Her hands trembled. She was barefoot, bruised by rejection, but her eyes were not broken. That moment carved something deep inside her, a fire that humiliation alone could not put out. Unseen by most, on the upper floor balcony, where a fine restaurant overlooked the mall's open space, an old man had watched everything unfold. His name was Chief Uzoamaka, a billionaire who rarely smiled, rarely spoke, and rarely intervened in anything beneath the surface of wealth and suits. But today, he had come for peace, for quiet, for tea, and instead he'd found a storm. As the girl was shoved, as her hand-woven baskets were crushed, something in him shifted. He didn't know her name. He didn't care where she was from. But he saw something the others didn't. He saw himself. Decades ago, he too had been barefoot, dismissed, told to go back where he came from. But no one had stood for him then, and yet he had risen. He watched her now, not her wrapper, not her dirtied hands, but the way she bent without shame, the way she didn't cry, the way she picked up every piece like it still mattered. He leaned forward slightly in his seat. The tea before him grew cold. Somewhere inside his chest, the silence cracked, and with it, something began to stir. A decision, quiet, gentle, but it would change everything. Chiamaka left the mall with nothing in her hands and everything broken in her chest. The sun outside felt hotter than before, not because it was noon, but because his shame burned deeper than heat. She walked slowly along the crowded roadside, passing vendors who shouted over each other, kiki drivers honking without mercy, and people who didn't even see her. Dust clung to her legs. Her basketless arms swayed with no purpose. She could still hear the guard's voice echoing in her ears. You don't belong here. Each step back to the small room she rented felt like walking backward in life. She had used all her transport money to come to the city. She had sold 2 chickens to buy that mall space. Or so she thought. What she didn't know was that her fall had planted seeds in the eyes of someone powerful. While the world looked away from her pain, one heart had taken note. But for now, she didn't think of that. She only thought of her mother's voice. Keep your hands clean, your heart cleaner. Even dust can carry gold if the sun chooses to shine on it. Chief Uzumaka sat alone in his car that night, the city lights flickering across his windshield like restless spirits. His driver didn't speak. He knew better. The chief hadn't said a word in hours, just stared out into the road like he was watching something no one else could see. But in truth, he was seeing everything. He remembered his youth in Nusuka, where his mother sold a kara with a cracked frying pan outside the church gate. He remembered how a rich man once kicked over her tray because he didn't want dirty food near his car. He remembered how he cried then, not from the loss, but from the insult. That pain had made him rich, but being rich had made him forget. Until today, until that girl with the wrapper and raffia baskets reminded him, not with words, but with silence, with a refusal to break. That was the kind of strength money couldn't buy. That was the kind of woman who didn't need permission to rise. And so, as the car idled in the dark street, Chief Uzumaka finally whispered just 3 words. Find that girl. His voice was soft, but his decision wasn't. Destiny had been disturbed. Chiamaka was folding her mother's wrapper when the knock came. It wasn't the kind of knock that came from debt collectors or nosy neighbors. It was slow, deliberate, as though the person on the other side wasn't in a hurry. She hesitated before opening. In front of her stood a man in a clean brown suit, not flashy, but serious. Behind him was a black car so shiny it looked like it had never touched a dusty road. He didn't introduce himself. He simply handed her a paper. It wasn't a summons. It wasn't a warning. It was a handwritten letter, sealed with red wax. Her hands trembled as she broke the seal. The paper read, You were wronged. Some eyes saw it. Come tomorrow morning to the address below. Come as you are. There was no signature, no threat, just invitation. Our first instinct was to ignore it. Maybe it was a joke, a trap, a rich man's entertainment. But something in her heart said otherwise. Something in her bones began to rise again. That night, she didn't sleep. She didn't cry either. She just stared at the letter, her hands still rough from weaving, her soul preparing for what was coming. Morning came with hesitant light, like the sun was also unsure of what would unfold. Chiamaka tied her wrapper tight and wrapped her mother's faded scarf around her head. She walked to the address, scribbled on the letter, a place she'd never dared to dream of entering. The gate alone looked taller than any house she had ever lived in. It opened slowly, like it had been waiting for her. Inside was not a palace. It was an office tower that scraped the sky. Uniformed men bowed slightly as she passed, their silence louder than any welcome. She walked across marble floors with her barefoot confidence, still unsure why she had come. When the elevator opened, a woman in black led her into a large office with high ceilings and floor-to-ceiling glass. The room smelled of sandalwood and rain. At the far end sat a man in traditional agbada, his hands folded, his face unreadable. It was Chief Uzumaka. But she didn't know that yet. He didn't speak. He only pointed to a chair. She sat, not because she was told to, but because something inside told her this was no ordinary moment. This wasn't a meeting. It was a turning. The silence hung like sacred cloth between them. Then the man spoke, not in English, not in authority, but in the calm, respectful tone of an elder, speaking to someone who reminded him of his roots. He told her a story, not about power or money, but about pain. How he once sold boiled ground nuts in the streets, how he once slept in a market stall, how he too was kicked out of places because his feet were too dusty or his accent too thick. His words carried no pity, only truth. He said the mall where she had been thrown out, he owned it, every tile, every elevator, every light bulb. And he had been there, watching as her dignity was stepped on. Most would have walked away, satisfied with their tea. But something in her reminded him of everything he had fought to become. That strength, that quiet defiance. It didn't need pity. It needed power behind it. He looked into her eyes and said one sentence that would never leave her soul. What they threw away, I will lift up. At that moment, Chiamaka stopped being just a villager. She became the center of something much larger than she had ever imagined. She didn't understand it at first. The paper before her was thick, heavy, like it carried more than words. It wasn't a job offer. It wasn't a loan. It was a transfer of ownership. The building where she was humiliated, the mall, was now hers. Chief Uzoamaka had decided it. Not as a gift, not as charity, but as an investment in justice. The name on the document was hers, written in gold letters. Chiamaka Ijeoma Eze. She stared at it, then back at the man who had spoken more through silence than any speech. Her lips trembled, but no words came. He didn't wait for thanks. He stood, handed her the key, an actual golden key on a velvet string, and said, "Make it yours." She left the building with the same wrapper, the same cracked feet, but now she carried something new in her hand and in her spirit. Outside, the sky opened with soft rain. People ran for shelter. She didn't. She let the rain wash her face, her shoulders, her memory of humiliation. Because now she didn't just belong. She ruled the place they said she had no place in. The simple villager was gone. What walked forward was a force. The day she returned to the mall, nobody recognized her. She wore the same wrapper and scarf, not because she lacked options, but because she wanted them to see the same woman they had humiliated. The guards at the gate didn't stop her. In fact, they saluted. The same hallway where her baskets were once scattered was now clean and quiet. Store managers who never noticed her before were now whispering, adjusting their shirts, standing straighter. But Chiamaka didn't speak. She walked through slowly, step by step, taking in every detail like an architect studying a broken house before building something stronger. She stopped at the corner where her raffia had been kicked aside, knelt slightly, and placed one small hand-woven basket there. She wasn't trying to sell. She was reminding the world who she was. People stared, some in confusion, others in shame. The woman they dismissed had returned, not with revenge, but with ownership. And her silence was louder than any insult they had ever thrown. The mall now belonged to her. But more importantly, her story belonged to her again. This time, she would write it with power, grace, and the same raffia that once tied her dreams together. Chiamaka didn't change the mall overnight. She didn't tear it down or fire everyone. Instead, she did what most billionaires forget. She listened. She walked into each shop and asked questions, not just about profits, but about people. She brought in local artisans from villages, gave them small stalls at no rent for 3 months. She placed clay pots at the entrance filled with fresh herbs, not just for decoration, but to remind every visitor of roots. She removed the no hawking sign and replaced it with a no disrespect. The security guards were retrained not to chase away, but to protect dignity. And in the center of the mall, she opened a cultural space called the Palm Thread, where children from schools came to learn basket weaving, storytelling, and the songs of forgotten elders. People came in expecting another rich owner's empire, but they left seeing something else, a heart. The air changed. The lighting felt warmer. And slowly, the place that once rejected the village became a place that celebrated it. She didn't just take control of the building, she turned it into a living proof that power in the hands of the humble changes everything. The story spread fast, from newspapers to WhatsApp groups, from radios to market tables. People began to talk. The girl they threw out now owns the whole place. Some said it was a miracle. Others called it luck. But those who were there that day remembered. They remembered her face, her silence, the way she gathered and scattered things without bitterness. One of the guards, the one who had thrown a basket into the trash, requested the transfer. He couldn't meet her eyes. The woman who muttered, "Go back to your village," now sold jewelry inside the same mall. When Chiamaka passed by her shop, the woman froze, but Chiamaka only smiled and nodded. No grudge, no revenge, just grace. People began to whisper her name, not with mockery, but with wonder. The Raffia girl, they called her. But she had become more than that. She was now a living proverb, a walking folk tale. Parents told their children about her, not as fiction, but as fact. And in quiet corners of the city, other villagers began to lift their heads higher, knowing that if dignity could return in one woman's wrapper, then anything was possible. Weeks passed, and the mall became the pride of the city, not just because of its new face, but because it felt like home to people who had never belonged before. One morning, a black government car stopped in front of Chamaka's office. A man stepped out with a letter bearing the city's seal. She had been nominated to join the local economic council, a room where only powerful business owners sat, mostly men in suits and English accents. Chiamaka stared at the paper, not in excitement, but with stillness. She knew what that room represented. The same system that once threw her out was now offering her a seat, not out of kindness, but because they couldn't ignore her impact. Her mall was attracting foreign attention, tourists, NGOs, investors, all asking how a place built on raffia and kindness was making more revenue than concrete malls run by tycoons. She accepted, not for herself, but for every market woman who never got invited. When she walked into that council room wearing her village wrapper and wooden beads, silence filled the air. They didn't see just a woman. They saw a movement that refused to bow. At the council meeting, men spoke with charts, numbers, and digital slides. Chiamaka brought none. When it was her turn to speak, she told a story. She spoke about market days, about how mothers knew how to turn one tuber of yam into 10. She explained how respect brings more profit than rules and how people buy where they feel seen. The board members were confused at first. Some chuckled, but when the reports were opened, growth, engagement, customer satisfaction, it became clear her methods weren't superstition. They were strategy. She introduced a proposal to allocate unused buildings in the city for grassroots traders, safe, clean spaces with affordable access. The room paused. They had never considered that power could come in native tongue and simple analogies. By the time the meeting ended, her idea had been voted in unanimously. One man clapped alone, Then the rest followed. Outside, journalists swarmed, cameras flashing. But Chiamaka walked through them quietly. She wasn't after fame. She was building something deeper than reputation. She was shaping a system that no longer stepped on the simple, but lifted them. That evening, a dusty envelope arrived from her village, no stamp, just her mother's old handwriting on the front. Inside was a single letter. It said, I heard they say you're a queen now, but I remember how you cried beside the fire when they mocked your raffia. I remember how you told me you would change the way they see us. You have. But don't forget, my daughter, that greatness is not in glass towers, but in hands that stay clean even when touching power. Chimaka wept, not with sorrow, but with memory. She placed the letter on her table beside the golden key to the mall. Then she took one of her own baskets, the last she had woven before leaving the village, and filled it with gifts, food, school books, and two small keys, one for her mother, one for the new artisan center she was planning in her hometown. The next day, a truck left for the village, and when it arrived, a crowd gathered because the girl who left with nothing had returned with something no one could steal honor. She didn't just carry wealth, she carried the pride of every overlooked hand. The truck that arrived in Chiamaka's village wasn't just carrying supplies, it was carrying a new dream. From the youngest girl pounding yam to the oldest man under the mango tree, everyone gathered as the truck door opened. Out came bags of rice, medical kits, learning tools, and clean wrappers for every widow in the community. But what brought tears to the villagers' eyes was something else. A tall signboard reading Center for Village Crafts and Wisdom, founded by Chamaka Ijoma Eze. The women ululated. Children clapped. Chiamaka's mother stood in silence, clutching the key her daughter had sent. She looked at the building in progress, mud walls mixed with cement, solar panels rising on the roof, and rooms that would teach weaving, carving, and dye making. For the first time in decades, the village didn't feel forgotten. A woman who had left with dust on her feet had returned with gold in her hands, not to show off, but to build up. The center wasn't just a structure, it was a message, a declaration that village skill was not backward. It was beautiful, valuable, and worthy of investment. The earth itself seemed to smile as that message took root. Inside the nearly completed center, baskets began to appear again, but this time in dozens. Young girls sat with thread between their fingers, laughing as they copied the patterns once taught to them by their grandmothers. Boys who once loitered the village square now carved miniature stools and hand drums. Elderly women became instructors. The entire community was alive with motion and meaning. Chiamaka didn't supervise with a clipboard. She sat among them, her wrapper tied tight, her hands moving just as fast as the others. She taught not from pride, but from memory. She knew every knot, every twist, every stitch, because she had learned them with hunger in her belly and rain dripping from the roof. Now she taught them in a place with electric fans, filtered water, and dignity. Visitors began arriving, journalists, government representatives, NGOs, but Chamaka remained the same. She greeted every guest barefoot, not as a symbol of poverty, but as a reminder that feet which walk humbly leave the deepest prints. And those prints were now shaping a generation. No longer was the village a place of escape. It had become a place of return, a source of strength. All because one girl refused to stay, stepped on. One morning, a girl about 10 years old brought a basket she had woven to Chiamaka. It was simple, uneven, the colors clashing slightly. She handed it over, her eyes searching Chiamaka's face for approval. Chiamaka turned it slowly in her hands, studying it like a priceless artifact. Then she smiled and said, "This was me, years ago." The girl grinned and skipped off. Chiamaka placed the basket on her office shelf right beside her mall key and council plaque. To her, it was the most valuable item she owned, not because it was perfect, but because it carried proof, proof that the cycle was now complete, that dignity had returned to where it once was crushed, that the same hand that was slapped away could now lift others. As she looked out the window of the center and saw the village buzzing with purpose, she whispered to herself the line her mother had always said: "Even dust can carry gold if the sun chooses to shine on it." And now the sun was shining on them all. The simple villager had not only survived, she had multiplied her story into hundreds, and the world had no choice but to listen. One morning, a fresh white envelope appeared on Chiamaka's table, delivered by hand with a golden seal. It came from the same mall where her baskets were once crushed, the same one now under her care. Inside was an invitation to an annual business award ceremony for entrepreneurs changing Nigeria's future. Her name was listed in bold as guest of honor. Chiamaka blinked twice before placing it aside. Not long ago, she had been kicked out of that very place for causing embarrassment. Now she was being celebrated for dignity. Life, it seemed, had a quiet way of circling back. She didn't inform anyone. She simply picked her oldest wrapper, the one she wore the day she was chased, and washed it gently with her hands. When she entered the mall that evening, the chandeliers sparkled. The same marble floors where her raffia had been crushed now glistened beneath her steps. Camera lights flickered. Music played softly. But all Chiamaka heard was the rhythm of her journey, rising with every step. This was no award show to her. This was a ceremony of reversal, a rewriting of the story in front of the very eyes that once refused to see her. After the speeches and flashes, during the mingling, one of the former security guards approached her. Older now, dressed in a proper suit, he stood at a distance as if unsure whether he had the right to speak. She saw him, and instead of turning away, she walked toward him with calm. His eyes dropped to the floor. "I didn't know," he said in a whisper only they could hear. "I was following orders." She nodded, not in agreement, but in understanding. Life had taught her that hurt people often pass down what they never healed from. She didn't offer forgiveness because he asked. She gave it because she no longer carried his actions inside her spirit. Another woman who once mocked her at the mall was now managing one of the new artisan stalls. That woman walked up to Chiamaka, tears in her eyes. But Chiamaka only smiled and placed a hand on her shoulder. The past could not be erased, but it could be redeemed. That night, many people came forward, not for photos, but for peace. And the woman they had once shamed stood tall, not because of her title, but because of what she refused to become: bitter. Months later, Chiamaka made one quiet change in the mall. In the same corner where her basket had been kicked into the bin, she installed a glass box. Inside it sat one raffia basket, the same kind she once tried to sell. Beside it, a plaque read, "This is not a product, it is a beginning." Visitors passed by, puzzled at first, but soon people began leaving notes beside the box, letters of their own rejections, stories of being overlooked, words they wished someone had heard. The box grew fuller each week. Eventually, a museum wing opened in the mall, showcasing stories of ordinary people who had risen after being dismissed. It became the heart of the building. Tourists came not just to shop, but to be reminded that transformation was possible, that pain could be fertilizer, and that sometimes the most powerful buildings are not made of glass and steel, but of spirit, soil, and silence turned into strength. Chiamaka stood there often, not as a billionaire or founder, but as a girl who once knelt on that same tile, gathering what others had thrown away. Now, that same corner was a monument, a whisper to the world, see us now. Chief Uzoamaka returned one quiet evening, long after the cameras and praise had faded. He didn't come in a convoy, no red carpet, no announcement, just his cane, his agbada, and the face that now smiled easily. Chiamaka welcomed him with a bowl of warm okra soup and silence. They sat in the cultural center she built, surrounded by children weaving, humming age-old village songs. "You did more than I expected," he said softly, gazing at the life breathing through the space. She shook her head gently. "You gave me the key. I just opened the right doors." He looked at her, not as a businesswoman, not as a success story, but as his equal. For the first time in his life, he felt his wealth had built something that would last beyond him. They didn't need to speak much. Their silence was full. When he stood to leave, he left behind a small bag, not filled with money, but with old raffia pieces from his mother's days, still smelling of palm oil and river dust. "Add these to your museum," he said. "She never got to see this world." And then he left with peace in every step. One Saturday morning, Chiamaka stood outside the village center as children gathered in a wide circle. They wore matching wrappers stitched from leftover fabrics, no two alike. In the middle of the circle stood an empty stool. Then a little girl walked into the center and placed a raffia basket on it. The children began to dance around it, clapping and singing songs that Chiamaka had once hummed while weaving under the mango tree with her mother. Elders watched with watery eyes. This wasn't just a performance, it was a passing down, a sealing of memory. The basket was no longer a symbol of poverty. It was a crown, an honor. That day, nobody spoke English, only the sweet, rhythmic language of drums, feet, and praise. Chiamaka sat in the shade, her hands folded over her knees. For once, she allowed herself to cry, not from pain, but from the full weight of meaning. Everything they tried to erase was now being taught in dance. The very thing they once kicked aside was now leading the next generation. She had not built a mole, she had built a living story, and now it danced in circles under the sun. Years passed. The world changed. Cities grew louder, but in the heart of that town, one mall still stood different. Tourists still came to see the place built by raffia, but now schools visited too. Every year, students sat beside elders to learn, to weave, to listen. Chiamaka grew older, her hair streaked with silver, but her eyes still bright with the fire that once refused to go out. One day, a little boy tugged her wrapper and asked, "Mama, how did you become so powerful?" She bent down, smiled, and handed him a thin raffia strand. "Because I never let go of this," she said, even when the world laughed. That boy would later become mayor, and in every speech, he told the story of a woman who turned rejection into renewal. Long after Chiamaka passed, her museum remained, her baskets remained, her lessons remained. And whenever a girl walked into that mall with cracked heels and big dreams, she saw her face reflected in every glass door. And behind it all, one truth endured. When a simple villager holds on to dignity. The world has no choice but to bow.